My name is Lacey Villava. I'm the Education Manager here at Gunston Hall. Thank you so much for joining us on our second summer Saturday of 2020. We're talking about archaeology today, and we'll be meeting with our staff archaeologist, Dave Shonyo, to learn a little bit more about archaeology at Gunston Hall and looking at why archaeologists study dirt sometimes. If you have questions at any point in our Zoom call, do feel free to pop those into the chat. We'll be paying attention to those. If you're interested in expressing your question or thought verbally, raise your hand, and in an appropriate moment, we will unmute you and invite you to share that. So to start off with, I do want to give you a little bit of a heads up on what we are talking about today. We're going to spend time this morning talking about the tools that an archaeologist uses. We're going to have an interview with our archaeologist, Dave Shonyo, and we're going to talk about categorizing dirt, looking at why it's important to learn about where things are based on the dirt that they're found in. Oops, sorry, I said that a little backwards. Learning about what we can find about things based on the dirt that we find them in. So before we get started talking about tools, I want to take a second and look at a couple of images. Now, these are images of our archaeology team at Gunston Hall and other team members. And I want to know, based on your experience, based on what you know about archaeologists, which one you think is the archaeologist. So here we go. We have two images. These are members of our team. I would like to know, based on your experience, is A or B our archaeologist in these two images? A or B? Go ahead and drop it into the chat, and I'll give everybody a second to look. Oh, thank you, Helene, for reminding us. We would love to know where you're joining us from, and if you have more than one person on your call with you, how many people are there? It helps us keep track of how many people are participating in an event. So you don't have to be as specific as Helene. You don't have to give me a name, but if you would tell me how many people are participating with you and just a general area of where you're from. A zip code is perfect. And I see some responses from some folks in the audience about who the archaeologist in the images is. This one's a really easy one. A is our staff curator, Samantha. She's obviously looking at some original documents with some visitors. And she is clearly not set to be doing archaeological work. B in this case is one of our archaeological volunteers at Gunston Hall. He's actually helping out some participants with an activity we do during our Colonial Day programs 3 times a year. All right, I've got one more slide. I'm curious to see in this image, who's the archaeologist, A or B? We'll give everybody a moment to take a look and make their guess. All right, I'm seeing some responses in the chat. A, you've got it. A is our archaeologist. That is our staff archaeologist, Dave. This one is a tiny bit tricky. B is also an archaeologist. This is our contract archaeologist, Lily. Lily is not with us today. She was on this day, I believe, also not prepared to do archaeology, so she's not quite dressed for it. Most of the time you will find archaeologists wearing long pants and often in the summer long sleeves because they spend a lot of time outside in the sun. You will also see archaeologists often with their socks tucked up around the legs of their pants to help prevent tick bites. They often wear hats, but more often than not, you are going to recognize an archaeologist by the tools that they use. So let's spend some time talking with Dave, our staff archaeologist, about the tools that he uses when he's at Gunston Hall. So Dave, I know you've picked out some tools to chat with us about today. Dave is our staff archaeologist, is the keeper of the tools, and you will often see him out there digging or supervising archaeology volunteers. So tell us about the tools that you selected to chat with us about today, Dave.
Okay, I just have a few of the tools that we use with me today. And kind of the interesting thing about archaeology is there are very few tools made specifically to be used in archaeology. The things we use are tools that were really intended for some other purpose, but we sort of co-opted them and used them for our purposes.
I see you guys out there all the time with 5-gallon Home Depot and Lowe's buckets.
Yeah. this is probably the most, let me get where you can see it.
Oh, that's perfect.
Most, yeah, this is probably the most complex tool that we use. And this is a surveyor's transit. And as the name suggests, it was made for surveyors. But in archaeology, we need to be able to specify exactly where we're digging on the site. And especially important in a place like Gunston Hall, where the things we find may be created eventually. We find a building. Eventually a building may be built there to indicate where the building was in the 18th century, and we have to precisely locate where, for example, where the corners of the building are located. So we use this surveyor's transit. Now this is sort of a dinosaur, because nowadays most of these things are very electronic and very digital. And this transit that we're using, because we can't afford anything else, is pretty similar to the transit that George Mason used 250 years ago to survey Gunston Hall and the area around Gunston Hall. So this thing is not really up-to-date technology. So
I've seen one of those more digital ones that you're talking about, Dave. I see them all the time, actually. I'm driving down the street and all of a sudden I'll see a couple of guys with them across the street from one another, the tools measuring distances. I think it's really fascinating that we're able to use tools from their original intent.
yeah, these things do the job, but they're kind of cumbersome. They take a long time to set up. You know, we have, well, here we have two things that when we're setting up, we have to get the bubbles here, and both of these right in the middle. And usually,
can you hold it up just a little bit, Dave? We can't see the levels. There we are.
There we go. And what usually happens, you get one of the bubbles in the middle and the other one goes off the middle. So you've got to flying back and forth.
Yeah, if anybody's ever tried to level something in their own house, my house is not square.
Yeah.
So whenever I get something level, my walls aren't square with a level.
Yeah. Okay. And
for us, Dave.
Again, the modern ones, you know, they tell you they use GPS to tell you exactly where they are. They level themselves. They have a little laser that'll shoot out and tell you how far you're away from something. And that's the big thing about a transit like we have that we're using, that there is often some inaccuracy in measuring distances because we actually have to stretch a tape measure between this thing and the place that we want to measure.
Mm-hmm.
And
sorry to interrupt, Dave. Speaking of measuring, I believe you have a measurement tool that you were going to talk about as well, don't you?
Well, I got a couple here. Okay, we use this a lot. This is a folding ruler. And again, this was made for carpenters. But this is kind of unusual because on one side, it has feet and inches. And the other side is the side we use. The foot is the same length, but it's divided into 10 parts. Okay? Can you see the number of them? And so if we were to measure something up to here, this would be 1.2. We would call this 1.2. And that's the way we'd write it. Or we'd say 1 2/10.
That's so handy. I'm really jealous.
Yeah, okay. A lot of times, in fact, most of the time in archaeology, metric system is used. But when we're working on a place like an old house, when that house was first built and the grounds were laid out, they were using feet. So we
makes sense.
Instead of using metric, we use feet to do all of our measurements.
Gotcha. I'm going to pause just for a second, Dave, because we've had some new folks join us. So I'm just going to remind everybody that if you have any thoughts or questions, you can type them into the chat. The chat button is down in the middle of your screen at the bottom if you hover over your Zoom window. If you have thoughts or questions you want to share for us, we are monitoring the chat and are happy to answer them. If you are interested in verbally expressing your questions, we'll have a few moments to do that in just a couple of minutes. All right, Dave, what's next?
Okay, here's kind of a neat little gadget. Again, it was developed for builders, it's a laser level, and this shoots out a laser beam, and we use it to make distances up and down.
Uh-huh.
particularly when we're digging an excavation unit, we want to get the floor of the unit perfectly flat. This is the easiest way to do it. We shoot this laser out into a ruler, not the kind I showed you, but a bigger kind of ruler, and it tells us how far down the floor is, and we can just measure around the floor and make sure that it's all level.
So do you set the laser level into the unit, Dave, or do you rest it on the edge of the unit?
The laser level sits on a tripod just outside the unit, and one of the things we do is use that ruler to measure how far this is above the ground, and that distance is what we have to subtract that distance to tell how far,
Got it.
how deep below the ground that whatever we're measuring is. The other thing we measure is we often want to know, how deep artifacts and archaeological features are in the ground, and we use this thing. Now the problem with this is kind of cumbersome to use when we're digging. And while we're digging, we use something called a line level. And I didn't bring one with me because it's kind of hard to explain, but it looks like those little bubble levels I showed you on the transit, except it's hung on a string, and we use that as we're digging to keep the floor of the excavation unit level. Okay. All right. Now, these are the things we use the most. These are called mason's trowels, and again, they were intended to be used by people who do brickwork, who build things out of brick, to put the mortar on top of the bricks. But you see
that one in your right hand looks well loved.
Yeah, these things are well used. Yeah, you see stains in the metal. And the important thing is they're not like garden trowels, which have a curve to them. These are perfectly flat. And most archaeologists use this pointed kind of. In our work, we mostly use these things because when we dig, we're going down in thin layers of soil, and we want each of those layers to be flat and even in the same depth. And it's much easier to use something like this to scrape across. When we're digging around something that's important, like an artifact or some kind of feature we're finding, it's kind of nice to have this small tip on to help dig with.
Awesome. Those are really neat. And I've seen you guys scraping that layer off. Is there a goal in how deep you go in each layer? Is it?
Well, it kind of depends where we're digging. Now, the reason we do that is normally, unless the ground has been disturbed like plowing or something, the artifacts that are the oldest are the deepest. And as you come up in the soil, things get newer. And what we want to do is take off thin layers so we get everything in that layer is approximately the same age. And this helps us in many different things. It helps us tell how old the deposit we're digging in is and that sort of thing. So
awesome. That's really cool.
Good. And sometimes we don't make it level with, we're going to talk about soil colors, but if you dug in the ground to any depth, you notice that the soil colors change as you go down. And these are actually layers of different kinds of soils. And sometimes we just dig off a whole layer, and it may not be exactly flat. And so this is
gotcha.
An exception to the rule of just digging things flat.
That makes sense.
Okay, how am I doing on my 10 minutes?
We could probably do one more object, and I'm going to ask if anybody has any questions that they want to express verbally to us. If you use the raise your hand feature by hovering over your name and clicking the more button, there will be an opportunity for you to raise your hand. Okay.
Now we're going to be talking about this a little later, and I don't think you'll see the real thing. This is a Munsell book, and what this is something that has color chips, and these Munsell chips are used for many different things where you have to match colors. But this one was made especially for soils, and all these colors are different kinds of soils. So when we're digging each of these layers I was talking about, we we actually measure the soil. And what we do is we put a little soil on our trowel and put it under one of the holes here. And we move it around until we find a color that matches the soil. So we record that. And what we do is we give it a kind of a code name. And this is, we put the page number, which is up here. This is 5YR. Then we put the number of the row and we put a number of the column. And when we write a report and we put it in these numbers, people will know exactly what kind of color we're talking about. If you take an example, you take some soil and ask somebody what color is this, you show it to five people, they'll give you 5 different answers of the name. But then you can take that number that I gave you, that page number and these column numbers, and go over here, and it will give you a name of that kind of soil, that color.
Yeah.
So it's
So this is like, Dave, for somebody who's not familiar with Munsell, perhaps like looking at a Pantone color chart or hex codes for doing colors on the internet, or RBY values. Sorry, that's not the right one. CMYK values, that's the one I meant.
Yeah. It's a way of standardizing the names.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Right.
All right. Now, do any of our participants have any questions that they would like to share with us at this point? We'll give you a moment to raise your hand if you want to, or type them into the chat and I'll read them aloud for Dave. Ooh, sorry about that. All right. Seems like nobody has any questions at this moment, but that's okay. If at any point you do have questions, type those straight into the chat, raise your hand, and we'll address them at an appropriate moment. I think that's all the tools that you brought to share with us, Dave.
Yes.
All right. So I know I have some questions. Whenever I talk to archaeologists, I always have questions about, why do you do what you do? How do you do what you do? Where did you have to go to school? So I have a few questions for you about what it is to be an archaeologist and what it is to be an archaeologist at Gunston Hall. So I am going to start with the absolute most basic one. What kind of school did you have to go to become an archaeologist?
Okay, I'm a little different from most people that end up being an archaeologist. I did study archaeology a long time ago when I was at the University of Minnesota, but I was in the Air Force for a while, and then I worked for the government for about 30 years as a information scientist. But during a lot of this time, I did volunteer work as an archaeologist. I didn't do it professionally, but I did volunteer work, so I stayed current with the field. And at one time, the state of Virginia had a program where you could qualify to have a certification to work independently as an archaeologist in Virginia. You go through this course and take tests and sort of thing. So I went through that. Then finally, when I retired from the government, I started working professionally as an archaeologist.
Well, I knew that you had been a civil servant for a while, Dave, but I didn't know that you had been in the Air Force. I want to take a moment to say thank you for your service. It's very much appreciated. I am also really curious about what is your favorite thing about being an archaeologist? What do you like the most?
That's a hard question because there's so many things I like about it. But I think the favorite thing is one that's the hardest to describe, because you really come face to face with history itself. When you read about history, it's what you read has a lot of opinion of the writer in it and what he thinks should have happened or did happen. Dig in the ground and you find this stuff that people were using 250 years ago. In the case of Gunston Hall, you could just come face to face with real history, with a real thing. Which you look at something that nobody has seen for 250 years. You're the first person to touch that since somebody had it in their hand that actually lived at Gunston Hall. And maybe it was somebody from the Mason family, maybe it was one of the slaves or one of the employees here. And that's, I think that's the thing that really draws me to the field of archaeology, just be that close to events that happened a long time ago.
Oh, that's giving me goosebumps, Dave. Ugh, that's
Yeah, yeah.
cool. You know, one of my favorite things about history is being able to go through old cookbooks, 18th century cookbooks, and try to recreate the flavors and the tastes and the experiences that people had. And I love thinking about archaeology in that way as well. That's really, really cool. So let's think about Gunston Hall for just a second. Tell me, why do we have an archaeology program at Gunston Hall? What makes it important for us?
Okay. When the Commonwealth of Virginia first acquired Gunston Hall in 1949, the only thing that was here that really went back to George Mason's time was the house itself, the mansion, and also some boxwoods that went down through what was George Mason's garden. And nobody knew anything else about what was outside the mansion. What did George Mason see when he stepped outside the door of his house? You know, we didn't know anything about that. Well, Gunston Hall wants to create the outdoor area now, so it looks as much as possible like it did when Mason lived here. And the only way, and there aren't any written records about that, and the only way we're going to find out about it is by looking for clues in the ground. And that's basically what we're doing in our archaeology program. It's called, the name for this, there are many different kinds of archaeology, but this is called landscape archaeology. We're really focusing on what was in the landscape, both what the land looked like itself and what kind of buildings were there. And Gunston Hall has launched a program to try to create the looks of the outside of the site to match what was here in the 18th century as much as possible. And the first big project we're working on now is putting a garden in that looks very much like the garden that George Mason had, based on the archaeology that we did out in the area. So that's you talk about what I like most about actually doing archaeology at Gunston Hall. The thing I like is what you do actually has the possibility of materializing in an actual building or actual change to the landscape. And very often in archaeology, you write a report that a few people read, and the artifacts go in a storage somewhere, and that's it. But here, somebody actually does something with what you find, and that is great.
That is really awesome. And we are also talking about, Dave, some other programs, other structures and features of Gunston Hall that we're hoping in the future to restore, including perhaps the stables and quarters for people who were enslaved that have since vanished. And I know you've done a bunch of archaeology on those spaces as well. I am so excited to see those come to life in the next 20, 30, 50 years. We may not still be at Gunston Hall at that point, but maybe we'll get to see them. I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, that's right. And I know you're going to ask this question, but what is my favorite thing that I've dug? And
Yeah.
I have to say, it's the slave quarters. Now,
Yeah.
places that slaves lived at that time were called quarters, and then they're basically still called quarters. And the Gunston Hall plantation, we know from written records that there were 6 slave quarters, but we don't know where they were. We think 4 of those quarters were on agricultural lands, and the people who lived there were agricultural workers, they were field workers. But there were also 2 quarters that were close to the mansion. One was called Logtown, and we've never been able to find Logtown. But there is a very brief mention in something one of George Mason's sons wrote about houses for servants that were to the east of the mansion. And a few years ago, we found those. There was a slave quarter there. And it's the first time I've ever dug something like this. And I've got to say, we know very little about the slaves that lived at Gunston Hall. And digging in this quarter, we just found hundreds of artifacts. And we found one of the footprint of one of the cabins that were out there, and a possible privy. but it's just, you know, it's in so many cases with the slaves, we talk about slavery as kind of an abstract concept, but these were individual people. And in so many cases, these people were born and lived and died, it's almost like they never existed because we don't know their names, we don't know what they did, we don't know what they look like. And in the case of Gunston Hall, we don't even know where they were buried when they died. But when you open up something like a slave quarter, like this slave quarter that we were working on, and you see these things, it's like people are talking to you from a distant time. You know, and this is what we ate off from. This is the thing. Some of the things we ate. See, you can see that in here that we were allowed to have guns to hunt with, and things like this, things that we never knew about these slaves, and it just, you know, it's not only an intellectual experience, it's an emotional experience to dig something like this. And I'm really, it's the one thing that I've done at Gunston Hall that I think of the most.
So Dave, would you mind telling us a little bit about some of the artifacts that you found in that dig? I know you did that dig over multiple seasons. So I'm curious if you'll tell our audience a little bit about one or two of the artifacts that you found in that dig that you find particularly important.
Okay, well, we found two big deposits of artifacts. One of them was a pit that was inside the cabin. And we don't know, and it was dug in a perfect circle, and we don't know why it was originally dug, but it eventually ended up being a trash pit.
Mm-hmm.
And we can tell by the kinds of things that were there, like we got literally hundreds of straight pins and stuff, like, you know, tiny things in there, and they were just sweeping the floor, you know, it was going into this pit. But there were also bones of some of the things that they're eating for meat. And the surprising thing is that most of the bones were from wild animals, from deer, from possums, even muskrats, you know, just, and that was really surprising, because we thought that Nason would have provided these people with most of the meat that they had. But we not only found the bones, but we found the things that the shot, what we call buckshot and birdshot,
Mm-hmm.
and they're just tiny little lead balls.
Tiny little pellets.
Yeah, little pellets in there. And so it looks like the slaves were actually allowed to have guns to go out and hunt with.
That is
We found,
fascinating.
yeah, and we found tons of fish scales and fish bones in there, you know, and so they were providing a lot of their own food for themselves, and Mason probably let them do it, let them have guns to do this, just so he wouldn't have to feed them, you know.
That is so fascinating. Although I'm having a moment where you found straight pins. How
Yeah.
do you identify a straight pin of all things when you find it in the dirt?
Okay. Yes. You know, when we dig, we put the dirt. We sift the dirt through a screen, and normally the screen has holes in it that are about 1/4 of an inch square. So a lot of little tiny things fall through that. But we take samples, and we screen it through window screening, which is much finer. So we catch a lot of the small stuff.
That's so cool.
And the screen is so fine that we need to wash it through. We take it and with water and wash the dirt through and wash it off. And so we end up with a lot of mud, but we end up with just a screen full of these tiny little things that we see when we're screening through our regular sifters.
Is that how you found that tiny little marine shell that we found that you located, what, 3 or 4 years ago now?
Yeah, that's another kind of fascinating thing that we found out that we absolutely did not expect. We found, what was it? I think it's 4 now, 4 different shells of snails that live in the Caribbean area. Now, what are they doing up here in Virginia? And I don't know, you know, we have records that show that most of the slaves that were brought up here and sold in Northern Virginia came not directly from Africa, but they lived in the Caribbean islands before and sold them off and they came up here.
Yeah, I think Oops, sorry, you broke up on me. Go ahead, finish your sentence.
Okay, why would they bring, I mean, they couldn't bring much with them, you know, there's maybe a few clothing items, you know, they're brought up here in slave ships, and why would they bring shells with them? And that's kind of a mystery. One of these shells is called a cowrie shell. We found it together with some other things. There are two pieces of petrified wood and a glass seal that had been attached to one of George Mason's wine bottles that had George and Ann Mason's initials on it, and they're just found together at the bottom of this circular pit I told you about. And I kind of suspect they were used for some kind of magic, you know, maybe very often in these slave communities, you had somebody who was called a juju man or a juju woman, and these are people who could tell fortunes or cast spells, and then they used various objects to do that. And I think maybe this is one of those little packages of objects that somebody like this was using.
We've got potentially some evidence of spirituality or religion came all the way from Africa, either
Yes,
through the American colonies or through the Caribbean and thence into Virginia. That's really,
exactly
really
right.
fascinating.
The cowrie shells were had a lot of symbolic importance in West African. So
That's awesome. Well, we've got a couple of participant questions in the chat. So let me read those out for you. We have a couple about the Munsell chart and soil color. One question is, do you have lots of different soil colors around here?
no, we don't.
Okay, so it seems to be pretty uniform.
Usually we only have a few, and most of those are in just one page of the Munsell book. Yeah.
What? So what page are you looking at?
NYR.
Curious.
Is that what you're using today? Most of them are on, yes, 10YR.
10YR. Oh, that's the chart we're going to share a little bit later. Fantastic.
Okay, most of the soils are these colors, and sometimes we find like clay, which are clay soils that are over here, but most of them are NYR. Yeah.
Awesome. So we have another question about soil colors. What do the different colors of soil mean? Okay.
They usually mean what kind of minerals they have in them. And we have, in addition to the colors, when we're recording these soils, we also record what kind of soil it is. Now, some of those kinds of soil are obvious. There's sand and there's clay. But then there's the normal soil that things grow in.
Topsoil.
But that's divided up into different kinds of soils, and usually they have different colors. And when we tell what kind of soils these are by just taking a sample and rubbing it in our fingers, so we feel it's kind of gritty. It has something in there. We call that sandy loam, and little pieces of sand are really fine. We call them fine sandy loam. And then when we rub this between our fingers and it rolls up into a ball or kind of a little rope, that means it's got clay in it, and then it is called a clayey loam. And if it just feels very smooth, but it doesn't ball up or roll up into a rope-like thing, that's called silty loam. And those are the kind of the three categories of loam we have here.
Awesome. Cool.
Yeah. Okay.
We have a question about where do we keep the archaeological artifacts we find at Gunston?
Okay, some of them go on display. We don't have a good display area right now for artifacts, but some of the more interesting ones go on display. But we have an area in the basement of one of the administrative buildings that used to be our archives, and so it's the air down there is kind of controlled for humidity and temperature. So it's a good place to store artifacts. And
so go ahead.
Yeah, and we can get at those because we catalog everything before we put them down there, and we put this into a computerized database. So we want to find something, we can just go to this database, and it will tell us what box and what bag inside the box that particular artifact is that we're looking for.
And once we take things out of the soil, we do want to keep them in a temperature-controlled climate, sort of the same humidity, same temperature year-round.
That's correct. Yes.
And why is that important? What happens if the humidity gets too high or too low?
Well, you have, with humidity, you always have a problem with mold getting on stuff and growing.
Mm.
Absolutely do not want that to happen. And some things like metal objects, iron, things with iron in them will rust, you know, faster. They're usually kind of rusty when they come out of the ground.
Mhm.
They'll just turn into nothing but rust if they're exposed to a lot of humidity.
Mhm. One of my favorite artifacts that you have pulled out in the recent past, Dave, is that pot leg, which
Yes.
looked like a big lump of rust when you first pulled it out. And some of the things that you've gotten cleaned and conserved, I don't remember if you've gotten that one done, but suddenly you can see the metal again, and it's amazing to me that such things have survived
Mhm.
in the ground for 200 years.
Yeah. Well, we're lucky here. Well, let me say in the first place, the land that Gunston Hall is, and this whole area along low-lying land to the east, is the soil is very acidic. So
Mhm.
stuff just rusts away, or organic stuff, it just disappears. You know, even bone
Mhm.
disappears after 100 years or so. But at Gunston Hall, in Mason's time, they really loved oysters. So there's a lot of
Mhm.
oyster shell in the ground, and the oyster shell counteracts this acidity, and so stuff in many places that we have oyster shell just preserves very nicely in the ground.
I have actually a picture that I can pop up on screen. These are some oyster shells, I believe, that y'all found last year or the year before. I think this is
Yeah,
um, one of the digs off of the edge of the kitchen yard.
yeah, this is typical. You know, we dig and we just, the oyster shells are all over the place.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, so we've got one last question in the chat, and we can probably take another question or two if anybody else has any others before we move on to our last activity of the day. So our question that I currently have ready is, could the shells, the marine shells that you were talking about, either the cowrie or the little baby tiny
Yeah.
Marine shells, could they have been part of another artifact, a bracelet, for example?
Uh, One of them has what appears to be punctures in it, and that could have been used as a bead, but there's no indication of the other one that they were ever used as jewelry. In fact, they're quite large. You know,
Hmm?
it would be kind of cumbersome to use as jewelry, but they may have. We just don't know. You know, but the one shell is. Look, is a smaller shell, and it does have little pierce pierce marks in it that looks like it could have been on a string at one time.
That's awesome. That's so cool. Does anybody else have any other questions? If you would like to ask a question verbally on the air, you're more than welcome to. You can raise your hand or unmute yourself and we will let you go. Do you have one, Tyler? All right, looks like we may not have any others, but that's okay. We do have one last activity this morning that we're going to go into. Dave has been talking rather eloquently about his Munsell chart. So I'm going to pop the supplies list up on screen in just a second. So at this point, you may want to get some slides ready. Or sorry, not slides. You may want to get some materials ready to do this activity. So I'm going to pop those up on screen. The link will not work for you, but if you type the URL in, you can go to gunstonhall.org/events/summer Saturdays archaeology and grab the Munsell chart worksheet, Munsell chart activity, the 10YR page. And then you'll want to grab a writing implement. And if you haven't already gotten some dirt from somewhere near your house, you may want to grab a sample or two, maybe even three. I've got two today. I collected one of them yesterday when it was kind of dry out. So my soil is really dry, really loose, and I collected one of them today. And I don't know about where you are, but it's been raining here. So my soil is very different. And Dave, I don't know if you have thoughts about dry versus damp soil and whether or not that makes a difference in recording soil types. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yes. Yeah, that's one of the problems with using Munsell charts is this color of the soil is kind of affected by the moisture in the soil.
That makes sense.
Also, it's also affected by the quality of the light. If you're in the shade, the color will look different than if you're in the right sunlight. So what we do is just have one person do all the soil measurements, because people's eyes will see colors a little differently. So we always have just one person do all the measurements of the colors.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and that's usually me, by the way, but.
I figured. All right, so I'm gonna pop my Munsell chart up on screen so you can see what that looks like. So here is the activity worksheet that we are working from. The 10YR is also a download separately, so you can get that a little bigger than it shows up on this screen. But I'm gonna start looking at my soil samples in just a second. So as Dave mentioned, we're looking at these soil samples. We are categorizing and recording where and how things are found, so that perhaps, Dave, and correct me if this is wrong, if you find something in one spot and 30 feet away, you find something in a similar soil layer in that dig, it's possible that those objects, those items are coming from the same time period. So that is one way to help record that. So we're gonna take a look at this chart. I've got two samples here, as I mentioned. I'm gonna label my samples. Bear with me just 1 second. Oops. I'm gonna label my samples number 1 and number 2 for the purposes of this activity. I'm having technical difficulties. I apologize, just bear with me for a second. It's not letting me click in where I normally would. There we go. So soil sample number 1, and I'm looking at my 10YR chart right now to see, oops, sorry, bear with me. That did not go the way I expected it. Got my 10YR chart open. I'm looking at it right now. I'm trying to decide what my color is. And I'm looking at the chart. And I think my soil sample, if I'm going on the vertical row first, so that on the left is listed as the value. I think my soil sample is in row number 3. It's really, really dark. So on my Munsell chart, I am going to put my hue down as 10YR, that's the page I'm using. I'm going to put my value down, that's that vertical row, or the numbers vertically, is a 3. And my chroma is I think a number 4. So it puts me on my chart with this one right here. So I've went over in the 3 row and the number 4 column. So it lands me right there. So I'm gonna put that chroma number in my chart as well. And now I'm sticking my fingers. I am gonna get a little dirty. It's really dry, it's really gritty, and it's pretty sandy. So I am going to circle my sandy loam. All right, so that's my sample number 1. My sample number 2, this is my damp one. This is the one that I collected today. And it is really dark, really, really dark. So this is sample number 2, and I am working in 10YR again. And I'm gonna go back over to my chart and take a look. I think this one is again in value number 3. So it's in this row again, and it is darker than its neighbor. So I think it is this one right here, also a number 3. And this one, as Dave was describing earlier, kind of rolls up into a ball when I stick my fingers in it. So that is our clay. Oop, I circled everything. Let's fix that. One more try. Circle the clay. There we go. So I have identified my 2 soil samples. Did anybody else get a chance to pull samples of their soil before our program today? Is anybody taking a look at their their charts want to share them with us, share their results, you can type into the chat if you've got any results. And for those of us who are just joining us, you're hitting us at the end of our Summer Saturdays program. This is our second Summer Saturday of 2020. We just had an amazing conversation with our staff archaeologist, Dave Shanyo. If you have thoughts or questions, you can type them into the chat or raise your hand if you would like to share them with us verbally. So we'll give everybody just a moment to get some thoughts in if they want. Or if you have any last questions pertaining to what Dave was chatting about when we were doing our interview with him or talking about tools, you can share those with us now as well. Well, I should also probably show you my soil samples since y'all couldn't see them while I was working on them. I've got one here that is, this is my really sandy loamy one, which is really dry and really loose. And my more clay-like one that balls up, but you can see it's really damp by comparison. It is very wet because it has been raining a lot here lately.
Lacey, I might add,
Yeah.
when you're doing the Munsell, you can go over to the page without the color chips and use that number and see what the name of that soil is.
That's true. That's true. Let me flip over to my Munsell chart and see what my names are. I have, oh, they're so tiny. This is the challenge of doing programs virtually. Someday, Dave, we'll be able to do this in person again, and I'll be able to actually look at the Munsell chart.
Well, I'll bet that they're an exciting name like Brown or dark brown. Yeah.
Gray, brown, and dark gray.
Dark gray. Oh, okay.
Colors. Well, it doesn't look like we have any other questions, but we do have some great comments. Dave, we have lots of thanks for you. Your enthusiasm is really obvious and catching. Somebody said that they're looking forward to doing the Munsell activity with their young neighbors. It was very informative and inspiring, your conversation. We've had some folks say, thank you so much for a great presentation. So in our last couple of minutes of this Summer Saturday, I would like to let everybody know that Summer Saturdays continues through the rest of the summer, every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. The programs are free, they will be recorded, and will be shared on our website a week to 2 weeks after they happen. We will be talking about a huge variety of topics. We'll talk about archaeology again. We'll be talking about food, one of my favorite things in history. Next week, we're talking about our garden, and you get to meet our brand new horticulturist, Ryan Dostal. He started with us, sadly, just at the start of the coronavirus epidemic. And we will also talk about games. And in 2 weeks, we will be celebrating July 4th with some 18th century ways to talk about your pride for country. So feel free to join us for any of those. If you can't make it on the day of, the recording will be available on our website. Thank you so much for joining us. And if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to stay, hang out in the Zoom call. Rebecca, Dave, and I will be hanging out here and answering questions for a few minutes if you have any. Thanks so much for joining us.